Hello and welcome to PlayFrame. My name is Dan, and this is the start of a story-focused and rather accelerated playthrough of Final Fantasy XIV. Except not today. Today, we are doing a primer. You see, for those of you who do not know, Final Fantasy XIV had a somewhat rocky start, like a true game dev nightmare scenario. To quickly summarize, Square Enix released this Final Fantasy MMO back in 2010, and it was not good. It was quite bad, in fact. Its design was clunky, it ran horribly, it was a disaster in pretty much every possible way. Now, most times when something like that happens in this industry, when a game ships in this shabby a state and reviews this poorly, the studio behind it just has to cut their losses and move on. Or go bankrupt and disappear, which is far more likely when that failed game is an MMO, one of the most expensive kinds of game you can make. But, as you can probably surmise, that is not what happened with Final Fantasy XIV. No, instead, they decided to make the MMO again. And I need to stress, this is basically unheard of. Square Enix had just thrown an enormous amount of funding at the development of this AAA MMORPG for their flagship franchise, watched that money pile burst into flame, and then decided to try extinguishing the fire by throwing another equally enormous pile of highly combustible money on top of it. And the wildest thing is that this worked. Final Fantasy XIV is a very good MMO now, and what's more, over the course of several expansions, it's also become a legitimately great Final Fantasy game. But because 2013's Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn functioned as a soft reboot, replacing the busted original release, the contents of that 1.0 version of the game have been completely overwritten. You cannot play it anymore, it no longer exists. But the 1.0 story is still technically canon, so since we can no longer experience that original story, I thought that I would put together a quick primer here to get you up to speed on what preceded the story of Final Fantasy XIV as we can experience it today. By the way, if you want to learn more about the story of how this MMO was miraculously resuscitated, and I highly recommend you do, it's one of the wildest feel-good stories in game development, I have two recommendations. The first is NoClip's phenomenal 3-part documentary on the game, which will give you the developer side perspective on what went down. The second is The Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV on the Speakers Network, a series which catalogs the game's history from more of a player perspective. Also, because I obviously can't capture 1.0 footage myself, I'm going to be using some clips from these channels in order to tell this story. Each clip will be appropriately credited in the corner of the video, and there are links to all of these channels in the description below. A big thank you to all of them for uploading this footage and preserving a glimpse of the before times for us. But okay, let's get to it. So, Final Fantasy XIV is set in a place called Eorzea, and you began the 1.0 version of the game as a freelance adventurer looking for work. You got to choose one of the 3 main city-states in which to begin your journey: Gridania, Limsa-Lominsa, or Ul'dah, each of which had their own local stories, troubles, and characters to encounter before you were sent off to experience the main plot. Now, I'm not going to bore you with a full recap of the original game story. Honestly, most of the details aren't that important, or even that interesting, and A Realm Reborn does a pretty good job at recapping the things you do need to know going forward. However, there are a few particularly interesting plot points and events that I think are worth going over. Starting with... Eorzea is the place you call home, but it's just one region in this game's world. There are several land masses on this planet, and one of them belongs to a nation called Garlemald. Where Eorzea is a realm of magic, the domineering Garlean Empire has recently undergone a massive technological revolution. Picture the Empire from Final Fantasy XII and you've basically got the idea. They are powerful and they are eager to expand and conquer their more primitive, magically inclined neighbors, Eorzea included. Their initial attack on Eorzea started pretty well. They quickly occupied one of the other major Eorzean city-states, Alamigo, and they were all set to continue the campaign, but it turns out they were not prepared for the local dragons. Their advance was brought to an abrupt halt when the great dragon Midgard-Sormr brought down their flagship, both crashing into a giant wellspring of ether. Ether is the source of magic in this world. It's more or less the life stream from Final Fantasy VII, basically, more or less. Anyway, the resulting explosion not only destroyed both the flagship and Midgardsormr, but also loosed a heck-ton of this ether into the surrounding environment. Ether which some would quickly begin to use in rituals, attempting to summon these magical demigods called primals. And that creates a problem for just about everybody, Eorzea included, because them things is dangerous. The Garleans would fall back for the time being, but this new primal threat only gave them new pretense for military action in Eorzea. Their leaders started to put together plans. We'll get to those in a minute. But back to you, the player in 1.0, an adventurer working with Eorzea's city-states a decade or so after the Imperial invasion stalled out. You spend your days trying to solve local problems, many of which ultimately have to do with those primals that are now popping up everywhere. Turns out that the other sentient species of Eorzea worship those things, and they keep trying to summon them against you. But during one of your adventures, you witness a particularly flashy meteor shower, and after that point, you start to experience some weird things. It seems that you have somehow developed the ability to magically witness past events. You don't have much control over this power, but it turns out you aren't the only one to suddenly receive this ability. Others in the world have mysteriously developed this power, which they call the Echo. And one of these people has even created a small underground organization dedicated to using it for Eorzea's protection. Much of your time in 1.0 would be spent working with this group and other allies to keep the primals at bay. Assuming, of course, you were actually patient enough to still be playing the 1.0 version of the game. As I said before, things looked pretty grim for Final Fantasy XIV at this time. Reviews were abysmal, players were unhappy, and the game was hemorrhaging money by the day. Enter Naoki Yoshida, lovingly known by the community as Yoshi P. Yoshida-san is handed control of Final Fantasy XIV after its disastrous launch. He assesses the situation with his team and determines that, unfortunately, the underlying structure of this game is simply too broken to save. There is no way they can salvage this foundation, much less expand on it in the years to come. So he puts together a plan. They will continue supporting the busted 1.0 version with patches and fixes and the additional content that was already promised, and simultaneously, in the background, they will rebuild Final Fantasy XIV from the ground up, completely replacing 1.0 with this new version once it's ready. It is a risky play, but at this point Square Enix does not have many better options to prevent long-term damage to one of their biggest brands, so the plan is approved. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0's days are numbered, and Yoshi P wants to send it out with a bang. So the Garlean invasion force has been busy rallying since that dragon fiasco, and the legatus of the 7th Legion, Nail von Darnus, has an idea. Using some ancient technology the Empire's been studying, Darnus proposes that they bring down one of the planet's moons, Dalamud, and drop it on Eorzea Meteor style. Not only would this Meteor project quickly eliminate all Eorzean opposition, but the Legatus argues that scorched Earth is the only practical solution to the primal threat. A risky strategy, to be sure, but at this point, Garlean leadership is feeling ready to roll the dice, so the plan is approved. Over the next year or so of content patches, as additional features come online, game stability slowly improves, and story content trickles in, players begin to notice the planet's lesser moon turn red, and then grow larger in the sky. And larger, and larger. Things in Eorzea start to get weird. Weather patterns change, bizarre monsters start popping up everywhere. Players even begin to see their characters experiencing nightmares when they log in. And as Dalamud gets closer, it becomes increasingly clear there is something very unnatural about the look of this moon. The players eventually succeed in defeating von Darnus and destroying the transmitter they used to bring Dalamud down, and yet, the moon continues to descend. In desperation, the Eorzean Alliance plans one last-ditch operation, a ritual to summon the gods themselves to Eorzea's defense. But the ideal location for this ritual is the predicted point of impact, which is currently occupied by Imperials, so the Alliance readies its armies for a fight on the fields of Carteneau. At this point, the 1.0 server shutdown is drawing near, and things look bleak for Eorzea. Dalamud is so close that it's getting hard to tell day from night. The devs are straight up just spawning monsters inside cities now, and in impossible numbers. All area music has been replaced by a faint vocal rendition of the game's original theme. Players either try their best to protect their hometowns from the monster hordes, or simply gather and wait to see what happens next. Then, just as the servers go dark, a new cinematic trailer is released depicting the Battle of Carteneau. Eorzean and Garlean armies fight as Dalamut looms just overhead. Then, unexpectedly, the mechanical moon breaks open, revealing a new and very angry problem. The Elder Primal Bahamut, now free, begins laying waste to everything. The god-summoning ritual fails, and in his final moments, one of your noteworthy ally characters, an old scholar named Louisoix, magically spirits the players forward in time to safety. Several months later, in 2013, Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn would launch, and the 1.0 players would log into these shiny new 2.0 servers to find their characters reappearing 5 years after the calamity, in a much better game and a very different Eorzea. And now you're caught up. I hope you have enjoyed this little primer, I hope the added context makes the experience of A Realm Reborn even more enjoyable, and I hope I will see you tomorrow when we officially get this Final Fantasy XIV story playthrough started. Until then,